Hi, I'm Karan Thapar. Over the last few years, I hope you've been watching my program, The Interview on the Wire. During that period, I've interviewed doctors, politicians, businessmen, scientists, authors, and even the occasional Nobel laureate. For me, it's been exciting. I hope it's been enjoyable for you. But these, as you know, are tough times, and if this program is going to remain bold, independent, and sometimes even defiant, then I think we need your support. At the end of the day, it's a truism, but editorial independence is best defended by the viewers. So if you would like this program to remain the way it is, forthright, outspoken, and interesting, then would you consider supporting us? All you have to do is to click on the description at the bottom. But more than anything else, I hope you will continue to watch the interview. Your viewership means an awful lot to me. Hello and welcome to a special interview for The Wire. Today, the 27th of May 2024, is the 60th anniversary of the death of India's first Prime Minister, Jawaharlal Nehru. And that raises certain important questions. How should we remember him? How much do we owe him? What were his greatest successes? What were his most glaring failures? Those are some of the key issues I shall raise today with one of the finest historians of modern India, the well-known and highly regarded Ramachandra Guha. Ram Guha, as I said in that introduction, today is the 60th anniversary of Jawaharlal Nehru's death, and I want to use the occasion to try and assess the Prime Minister so that we have a better idea not just of his achievements and failures, but also the challenges he faced, the goals he set himself, as well as the personality of the man. Now, in your essay, Verdicts on Nehru, the Rise and Fall of a Reputation, you write, it is safe to say that no modern politician had anywhere near as difficult a job as Jawaharlal Nehru. At independence, the country he was asked to lead was faced with horrific problems. No new nation was ever born in less propitious circumstances. Are you, in effect, saying he started his prime ministership with his hands virtually tied behind his back?
I would say hands tied behind his back because he had some remarkable colleagues with him whom we'll talk about, I'm sure, as the conversation goes on. But it was a very complicated, difficult, unprecedented predicament. India had been freed but also partitioned. There were bloody communal riots all through 46 and 47. There were millions of refugees who had to be resettled. We are also just coming out of a world war, which has grievously disrupted the economy and society of India. We've seen the famines in Bengal, in which millions of people have died. Then there's the problem of the princely states, several of whom are clamoring for independence. A new state machinery has to be built to replace the departing colonial structure. In contemporary terms, we have a ethnic conflict in Manipur that's been going on for a year now, and which has been unattended to by the central government. In 1947, India had maybe 500 or 800 Manipurs. There were smoldering fires everywhere that had to be put out. The confidence of people had to be restored. A new nation had to be built. Different segments had to be brought together. And it all had to be done peacefully. There was shortly after independence, Godse, a right-wing fundamentalist, murdered Mahatma Gandhi. Shortly after Godse's murder of Mahatma Gandhi, the communists, as directed by Stalin, launched an armed insurrection against the Indian state, something which we should remember, that Nehru's government faced attacks from the extreme left as well as the extreme right. So in this kind of terribly fraught and very, very complicated and troubled situation, to work together, to build a team, to form a government, to help forge a constitution, to bring about peace, stability, harmony, reassurance. And then, of course, there was the whole question of the international situation, with the Cold War emerging and the superpower rivalry becoming sharper between America and the Soviet Union. So in that sense, I say Not just, I mean, it is inconceivable to someone living today how difficult and complicated the situation that Nehru and his colleagues faced in 1947.
Let me at this stage ask, why did Mahatma Gandhi choose Nehru rather than Vallabhbhai Patel as Prime Minister? What qualities did the former possess which the latter might not have had?
So, for that, you have to go back to the years of the freedom struggle. You know, Nehru became Prime Minister in 1947, but he and Patel had both been active in the freedom struggle for 3 decades before that. They both really joined Gandhi around 1917, 1918, and they had different attributes. Patel was a fabulous organizer. He built the Congress machinery. He organized major peasant satyagrahas in Gujarat. And Nehru was a more charismatic person, reaching out to other parts of the country. Now, as early as the late 30s, Gandhi said, after me, Jawaharlal and Vallabhbhai will succeed me in that order. Why that order? Patel was older. Patel was arguably more pragmatic, a better administrator. But what Patel lacked was an appeal to all sections of Indian society. Patel, like others in the Congress, like Rajendra Prasad and Rajaji, was a remarkable patriot and nationalist, but essentially he was an upper caste Hindu male. So, and in Patel's case, also a North Indian Hindu male. This is something which, Nehru's fiercest critics today, and I often get emails from them, and I'm sure some will come in after this interview, tend to be North Indian Hindu males of a certain vintage. Now, what they don't understand is that Nehru appealed to South India. He saw the importance of different parts of India, not just the Hindi heartland. He was trusted by Muslims, and above all, he was a passionate believer in gender equality and had many female friends. He had worked very closely with female leaders in the Congress like Kamala Devi Chattopadhyay, Sarojini Naidu, and of course, many, many others. So Gandhi understood that if you wanted to unite such a diverse and disparate country, if you wanted a leader who was, in Nehru's case, a Hindu trusted by Muslims, a man passionately committed to gender equality, and also a North Indian, regarded with some respect in South India. And also, finally, two other advantages he had over Patel. One was that he was much younger. He was more than a decade younger than Patel, so obviously he had longer to go. And he had an international outreach. He was the only leader of the Congress party. Not even Gandhi had a real interest in international geopolitics. Nehru had traveled in, all across Europe. He'd been to China. He'd been to Japan. He'd written about international affairs. So I think these were the reasons why Gandhi chose Nehru very early on. And I think it's part of, it's a mark of Patel's decency and commitment to the country that he recognized that Nehru was, in the circumstances, a more appropriate leader to unite such a diverse and fragmented country. And he worked solidly with him. I think one of the great forgotten stories of that period is how Patel and Nehru set aside their differences and worked together for the interests of the country.
Now, despite the horrific challenges Nehru faced when he took over as Prime Minister, India became a credible democracy with freedoms of speech, worship, association, a credibly functioning parliament, a free press, and an independent judiciary. How much of that was because the constitution deemed it should be so, and how much was because Nehru was determined this should be the outcome?
You see, Karan, today is Nehru's 60th death anniversary. So, because of that, we are naturally focusing on Nehru. But he was one among a cohort of remarkable individuals. No doubt, as Prime Minister, he was the fulcrum. He was the ultimate arbiter, the most important decision maker. I mentioned Patel, but there was Ambedkar, who, and it's again, these are things that young Indians must know, particularly now when we live in a time of such poisonous and partisan politics, with filthy abuse hurled by politicians at their rivals from other parties. That at this time when India became independent, the Congress and Gandhi decided we want the best minds regardless of what their previous political affiliation was. So Ambedkar had been a bitter opponent of the Congress to the 30s and the 40s, but he was brought on board as law minister because of his brilliant legal acumen. And he played a critical role in helping draft the constitution. I mentioned Patel. They were outstanding civil servants. Someone, as we come to the end of this very long and bruising and controversial election, we should remember the first chief election commissioner, Sukumar Sen, who was a brilliant administrator who set the mechanism in place for all subsequent elections. There were social workers who resettled the refugees, like Kamala Devi Chattopadhyay, whom I mentioned. So our founding cohort was composed of truly remarkable visionary men and women. And because he was prime minister, Nehru inevitably was at the center. This is not to discount at all the absolutely vital and sometimes equally significant roles played by people like Patel and Ambedkar. But
And I will mention for the sake of the audience that another member of that staff-studded first cabinet was Shyama Prasad Mukherjee, the man who later founded the Bharatiya Janasangh. He too was in Nehru's first cabinet.
And also Baldev Singh of the Akalis. I mean, there were several other, representatives of the industrial community. John Mathai, who worked with the Tatas, was a member of that cabinet. Absolutely.
So you're saying the credit for the fact that India emerged a credible democracy with freedoms of speech, association, a credibly functioning parliament, and independent judiciary, that credit is shared equally with everyone who came to power in August 47.
I mean, they all played major roles. I'd say that, if you want to single out 3 or 4, I would single out Nehru, Patel, Ambedkar, and Kamala Devi Chattopadhyay. But it's actually a cast of dozens who helped shape this republic.
Now, the economy in Nehru's days was what was called a mixed economy. The government set up steel plants and dams and much of heavy industry. No doubt that gave India an economic foundation that it did not have up till then. But was Nehru mistaken not to pursue the sort of export-led growth that took countries like Taiwan, Korea, Singapore to growths of 8, 9, even 10%?
So, Karan, hindsight is 20/20, as they say. In the early 1950s, the zeitgeist, or the spirit of the age, was in favor of the mixed economy and planning. Russia, Soviet Union had played the most important role in defeating the Nazis, and many people attributed that to their heavy industry strategy. So this was the spirit of the times. When the second 5-year plan, which mandated public sector-led heavy industrialization, was framed, it was shown to 24 Indian economists, and 23 approved of it. Only one, a brave dissenter called B.R. Shenoy, who was thinking far ahead, opposed it. So in some ways, it was important that the state play a vital role in managing the economy. Even the Bombay Plan, framed by capitalists such as Birla and Tata, asked for an important role for the state because our industries then didn't have much capital. But by the late 50s and the early 60s, it was probably time to open out. Rajagopalachari had coined his phrase license permit quota raj to define the system of state control. Now, so at Nehru, undeniably, was suspicious of business. This came maybe from his aristocratic lineage, his Fabian heritage, but he was representing the zeitgeist. It was not Nehru alone who adopted that strategy. And again, in fairness to Nehru, the real time for economic liberalization was the 1960s. That's when Korea and Taiwan and those other countries you mentioned liberalized. And Jagdish Bhagwati wrote a famous essay asking India to liberalize. And instead of following Bhagwati's advice, Indira Gandhi actually went the other way and nationalized further. So Nehru bears some responsibility for inculcating a kind of suspicion towards business. But essentially, he and his colleagues thought that a newly independent country with a tentative risk-averse capitalist class, in such situation, the state had to, in his terms, occupy the commanding heights of the economy.
Now, Ram Guha, one of the challenges Nehru faced was that he inherited a very sizable Muslim population, one that was battered and shaken by partition, uncertain and unsure of its position in India, or even whether it belonged to the country at all. How effectively did he handle this challenge? And today, when he's accused of appeasement, is that fair or is it deeply mistaken?
Karan, this is one of the key reasons that Gandhi chose Nehru. That like Gandhi, Nehru did not believe this was a country that belonged to Hindus alone. After India became independent, Nehru wrote a series of wonderfully moving and still entirely relevant letters to chief ministers saying and I'm quoting from memory, saying, whatever Pakistan does to its Hindu and Sikh minority, we will treat our Muslim and Christian minority as equal citizens. They will have the same rights as anyone else. And it's quite extraordinary that from 1947 till 1963, there were no communal rights. Muslims felt safe, they felt respected, they felt part of the national community. Now, it is true that in the late 1950s, mid-1950s, when Nehru's government reformed the Hindu personal laws to give greater rights to women. At that stage, they did not implement a uniform civil code because it was felt that the Muslims are not yet ready. There is no social reform element within the community itself. By the 1980s, this could have been done. And again, it is Rajiv Gandhi and not Nehru who is really guilty of Muslim appeasement because he overturned the Shah Banu judgment of the Supreme Court. And you know what happened as a result, that led, among other things, to the spectacular rise of the Hindu right. So Nehru's message that this is not a Hindu Pakistan, this is a country in which everyone, regardless of their gender, region, language, and above all, religion, has equal rights and equal claims, is vitally important today. In India today, Muslims are beleaguered, harassed, often persecuted. They are made to feel like second-class citizens. Of course, not just by the ruling party, but also many opposition leaders are very hesitant to come out in favor of equal rights for Muslims. So I think this is an element of Nehru's message, which shows his deep humanity, his compassion, and his profound understanding of what India should be, namely a country which everyone, regardless of their religious affiliation, has an equal stake.
Just to pick out one important thing from your answer, the claim that Nehru was an appeaser is mistaken and completely wrong.
Absolutely. You know, if you study this carefully, Nehru tried very hard to get progressive Muslims, reform-minded Muslim leaders into politics, and including into the Congress party. So one of the reasons he supported Sheikh Abdullah so much was Sheikh Abdullah was a progressive, reform-minded Muslim who believed in equal rights of women, the importance of modern science, in shedding archaic religious practices. But Sheikh Abdullah then decided to, try and break away from the Indian Union. Then there was a remarkable man called Saifuddin Taibji, who was brought into parliament. He died young. So Nehru wanted very hard to cultivate a progressive Muslim constituency to start the process of social reform within the Muslim community to match the process of social reform that was more advanced among Hindus, particularly with regard to gender rights. And that's the way he was thinking. But he wanted to move slowly because he knew the legacy of partition. He knew that he had to bring Muslims on his side, on the side of the government, with patience, with understanding, with empathy. So the charge that Indira Gandhi was a Muslim appeaser has some substance. She would ask the Imam of Jama Masjid for votes. The charge that Rajiv Gandhi was a Muslim leader, a Muslim appeaser, has even greater substance because of his flip-flop on the Shah Banu case. But Nehru's absolute commitment to religious pluralism, which is also Gandhi's absolute commitment to religious pluralism, is still vitally relevant and necessary to our republic today.
Now, under Nehru, India enjoyed an international profile way, way greater than its economic or strategic standing could explain. Some people say that was the genius of non-alignment. It created a space between the Soviet and Western blocs that India could and did occupy. Would you agree? And secondly, did Nehru always live up to his non-aligned principles, or did he let himself down with the position he took over Hungary in 1956?
So correct, yes. I think non-alignment on the whole was a very judicious policy. We refused to take sides. We were able to avail actually of benefits and funding from both sides. For example, our IITs were started with the help of different countries, likewise our steel mills and so on. So identifying with the Americans, where that took Pakistan. Identifying with the Russians, where that took Cuba. So if you look at non-alignment, it was a very sensible, pragmatic, wise policy from which we benefited. However, Hungary was an aberration. Earlier in that year, the French and the British had invaded Egypt, and we rightly chastised them. Later in the year, the Russians invaded Hungary, and we were equivocated. Some people would like to blame Krishna Menon because he was the guy who actually in the UN equivocated, and Nehru tried to course correct, but it was too late, and it was certainly a blot on non-alignment. His failure to come out as quickly and as directly in condemning the Soviet invasion of Hungary as he had in condemning the Anglo-French invasion of Egypt.
Now, Ram Guha, everyone remembers, and justifiably, the fact that Nehru gets credit for the IITs and IIMs he created. But did he do enough in terms of primary education? Or did he fail to give it the importance it demands, thus and thereby setting a tradition that his successors have unfortunately followed as well?
Yes, I mean, of course, again, one must put it in context. Education is a state subject. So in some ways, it was and remains the responsibility of the states to promote primary education. And you can see some states like Kerala and Tamil Nadu have done much better than states in North India, because their state governments, inspired by a reformist agenda and a belief in gender equality, have taken primary education further. But having said all of that, even if education was not a union subject but a state subject, Nehru could have given it his moral backing, his charismatic support. He was a person of great inspiration, influence, and authority. Now, of course, it's deeply unfashionable to praise Nehru. But in the 50s, there was a halo around him. He was that great golden sun shining in Delhi, which radiated light and hope all across the country. And he should have and could have given much more emphasis to the vital need to eradicate illiteracy. After all, he was a self-confessed socialist, and that's what the socialist countries had done. He was enchanted with modern science, and we should be grateful to that, because apart from the IITs, he also gave us such remarkable institutions as the Tata Institute of Fundamental Research. He laid the foundations of our space program and so on. But I think if I may just add one footnote. When the second plan was formulated, a great deal of money was allocated to large dams and steel mills. And there was a young economist in Bombay called B.V. Krishnamurthy, who did a back-of-the-envelope calculation and said if the money allocated to large infrastructure projects had been allocated to primary education, it would have had much more beneficial economic impacts in the long run. So it was a conceptual blindness on Nehru's part. Admittedly, the states would have had to take it forward. They would have had to battle, caste prejudice and inequality within their own domains. But as compared to modern science, as compared to his promotion of steel mills and large dams, which he called the temples of modern India, Nehru did relatively neglect primary education, and we paid for that.
Is that also true of the way Nehru handled primary healthcare? I know that AIMS was set up during his time.
Yeah.
Was he equally neglectful of primary healthcare that matters so much to individual people, particularly when they're poor?
See, at that stage, maybe there were other priorities, but primary education, creating a level playing field, so that regardless of whether you're a Brahmin or a Dalit, you go to the same kinds of schools, so you have the same opportunities in later life, which is what socialist countries like Vietnam and China and the Soviet Union, countries that are disfigured by their authoritarian systems, have nonetheless achieved. So I think the egalitarian in Nehru, the socialist in Nehru, should certainly have paid much more emphasis on promoting universal literacy and a kind of basic school system from the 1950s onwards.
Now, perhaps his biggest mistake was his handling of China. We went from Hindi Chini Bhai Bhai in the mid-50s to war by 1962. Was he too trusting of China when you look back on his time? Or did he simply fail to give the border dispute the importance it deserves?
I think both. There's a famous letter which you are aware of, which Sardar Patel wrote to Nehru in 1950 after the Chinese invasion of Tibet, where he said, incidentally, it is believed that the letter was drafted by Patel by Girja Shankar Bajpai, but be that as it may, that letter said, Patel was warning Nehru, and he was saying, the Chinese are nationalists before they are anti-imperialists. they're nationalists before they are communists, and we should worry about their annexation of Tibet. I think if you look at the decisions Nehru made in appointments, arguably the worst was to appoint Krishna Menon as defense minister. Krishna Menon was a better diplomat. I mean, at the UN, he defended our case, barring exceptions like Hungary, quite well on Kashmir and things like that. He was pretty good. But Krishna Menon, was a brilliant man, a very well-read man, but arbitrary, capricious, not a great administrator, and with a pathological suspicion of the West. And if, in pursuit of our non-alignment, we should have been willing to buy arms and military know-how and acquaint ourselves with military know-how from both the Soviet Union and the Anglo-American bloc, which we didn't. So we were underprepared, largely because of Krishna Menon. And again, Nehru had been warned of it. I mean, there's again, I mentioned Patel's letter of 1950, but in 1959, Acharya Kriplani, who was by then in the opposition, but had been with Nehru in the freedom struggle and still had very good mutual personal relations with Nehru, gave a famous speech in Parliament about the first Chinese incursions in 1959 and why we needed to be more prepared. But for whatever reason, Krishna Menon was removed from his job only after 3 years later, only after the debacle at the border.
So are you suggesting that in handling China, one of the critical mistakes Nehru made, this is in addition to being too trusting of China and not taking the border dispute seriously enough, a third critical mistake was to appoint Krishna Menon as defense minister?
Not just appoint him, but to keep him in the post long after it was clearly recognized that he was, not best fitted for that job.
Now, let me at this point, Ram Guha, once again go back to Sardar Patel. As you know, in recent years, a huge controversy has arisen about the nature of Nehru's relationship with his Deputy Prime Minister and Home Minister, Sardar Patel. How would you describe their relationship? And was there an effective jugalbandi as Prime Minister and Deputy Prime Minister?
Very much so. First of all, I should say that this posthumous rift that has been created by Nehru and Patel is largely a consequence of the Congress itself becoming a family firm, and from Indira Gandhi right on to Rajiv Gandhi and Sonia Gandhi and Rahul Gandhi, the Congress has forgotten its other great stalwarts, not just Patel, but Kambaraj Bose, Sarojini Naidu, Kamala Devi Chattopadhyay, Y.B. Chavan, and dozens of others. And as Gopal Gandhi famously said, the Congress disowned Patel, and the BJP has the Congress disowned Patel, the BJP has misowned Patel, and now set up this posthumous rivalry. Now, Patel and Nehru certainly had differences. They had temperamental differences, philosophical differences, even ideological differences. But it's a mark of the greatness of both men that after Gandhi's murder, they set aside those differences to work together to build a united and democratic India. And their roles were complementary. I mean, I've said this in print, that Nehru's principal job, was the emotional integration of India, to bring the South, the Muslims, women, Adivasis on board. Patel's job was the territorial integration of India through the heroic work of bringing the princely states into the Union. And they also had other contributions. We've talked about Nehru's work for modern science, his promotion of secularism. Patel modernized the civil service. Patel also worked very closely with Ambedkar and others in having the constitution passed. But it was absolutely a jugalbandi. I am convinced that if Nehru did not have Patel, he could not have done the work he did in unifying India and giving it a democratic template. And if Patel did not have Nehru, likewise, the job would have been incomplete, half finished, and possibly a failure. So we were really, really lucky. I mean, again, if you look at the jugalbandi since, I mean, we've had Indira Gandhi and P.N. Haksar, we've had Vajpayee and Advani, we've had Sonia Gandhi and Manmohan Singh, and most recently we've had Narendra Modi and Amit Shah. And as a historian and as a citizen, I'm in absolutely no doubt that the jugalbandi between Nehru and Patel was the noblest and the most necessary. Without that jugalbandi, you and I would not be talking today. Without that jugalbandi, India wouldn't have fragmented in many parts. It may have come under military dictatorship. There could have been civil war. We could never have had a democratic constitution and an independent republic had it not been for that jugalbandi.
Naram Guha Nehru was 74 when he died, while still in office. He was still Prime Minister the day he died. And the question after Nehru, who had already begun to be asked. Did he leave the Congress party, and indeed, did he leave the country in a fit position to answer that question?
Look, Karan, this leads me to one, shall we say, perhaps mistake Nehru made, which we've not discussed so far. We've discussed primary education, we've discussed China, we've discussed, on the other hand, on the other side also his considerable achievements. In 1958, after a decade in office, Nehru took a holiday in Kashmir and decided to give up the office of Prime Minister. He was then a little short of 70. He'd, done remarkable work in helping to build this country. And he thought, I should go now. I have books to write, I have grandchildren to play with. And he came back and he was persuaded not to resign. Now, we don't know whether it was he felt he was still needed, or whether, the acolytes around him told him he was indispensable. But if Nehru had left in 1958, I think his reputation would be far more intact and far more readily acknowledged and admired than it is now. He stayed on too long. And this is, of course, true of many people in politics and in public life. They stayed on too long. So, at the same time, when he did fall ill in 1963, he recognized he had to, at least indirectly, anoint a successor. Lal Bahadur Shastri, who had left the cabinet, came back in, was given important responsibilities, was close to Nehru, and it was very clear that Shastri would succeed him. And in that sense, Shastri was his chosen heir, but the decline that had set in from about 1960, before the China War, Nehru was losing his health, losing his authority, losing his aura. And if he had retired in 1958, I think history would have treated him much more kindly than it does now. And it's a lesson for all of us, especially men. Men are deeply reluctant to give up power, prestige, authority. Look at, for example, if you look at other spheres of life, an Indian in his own sphere, as remarkable as Nehru, was Varghese Kurian, who built our cooperative industry and who inspired the film Manthan, which has just been shown again afresh in Cannes. Now, Varghese Kurian also stayed on too long.
Sure.
It's true of, as you know, in many spheres of life. So I'd say, Nehru should really have gone in 1958. It would have been better for him and better for the country.
Now, the one thing that is true is that there has been a sharp decline and fall in Nehru's reputation after his death. In your essay, as you put it, you say, the hero of one age has become the outcast of another. Why has that happened?
So there are two reasons for that, Karan. One is, of course, the shift in Indian politics and the rise of the Hindu right. Now, the Hindu right, well before Narendra Modi, has always detested Nehru. They detest Nehru because of his cosmopolitanism, his openness to the world. They detest Nehru because of his humanity, his sense of humor. They are all basically puritanical, humorless people. And they detest Nehru because he thought Muslims were as equally Indians as Hindus. So, and Modi particularly is obsessed with Nehru. Nehru is kind of Modi's intimate enemy. He is always judging himself with reference to Nehru. He wants to be seen as a more consequential, a more influential, or more impactful, a more noteworthy prime minister than Nehru. And it's unlikely, of course, that history will judge him like that, but that is his obsession. And I think that's one part of it. That's one part of the reason with the BJP in power for the last 10 years and before that under Vajpayee, state institutions and the media that they controlled was just taught and instructed to disparage Nehru. But the other reason is the illegitimate control of the Congress party by his family. As I said, Nehru very clearly was grooming Shastri and not Indira Gandhi to succeed him. And if Shastri had not died prematurely of a heart attack in 1966, there would have been no dynasty. But once the dynasty happened, whatever they do is retrospectively, blamed on Nehru. The sins of the father, the sins of the descendants are visited on the father. So I think these are the two reasons why Indian citizens can't see Nehru clearly. It's always a clouded vision. It's a vision clouded by the hatred and the hostility towards Nehru from the Hindu right, and clouded on the other side by the illegitimate, unwarranted appropriation of Nehru by his biological descendants. On his 60th death anniversary, we are trying to discuss him objectively, dispassionately. In the round, will we succeed? I very much doubt it because of these two aspects of our contemporary politics, dynastic control of the Congress party, and the rise of the Hindu right that inhibit a proper, judicious, fair understanding of Nehru and what he did.
So you're saying that today, the reservations people have, maybe even the dislike some people feel for Indira Gandhi, Rajiv Gandhi, Sonia Gandhi, and now Rahul Gandhi are inflicted backwards on
Absolutely.
their ancestor Jawaharlal Nehru. He suffers on their behalf.
Very much so.
You say he made mistakes, to be sure, but other people in his place would most likely have made bigger ones. And you add, we Indians were very lucky to have him as prime minister for as long as we did. Are you saying there are very few people who could have done the job he did in the trying circumstances he faced better than he did?
Yes, absolutely. If you just look at our neighboring countries, Jinnah, who was the founder of Pakistan, died within a year. Mujib, who was the founder of Bangladesh, was assassinated 4 years after independence. I mean, look at African countries where you had charismatic leaders like Kenyatta and Nkrumah, who either became dictators or were overthrown by military coups. So if you look at the ex-colonial countries of Asia and Africa, India stand out for being so large, so diverse, and yet united and democratic, and having made substantial economic progress. Even when you come to economic progress, Karan, had Nehru and Patel and their colleagues not united this country emotionally and territorially, we would not have had the benefit of economic growth because we would have not had a single market, we would have not had an IT sector, and so on and so forth. So, notwithstanding his mistakes, which we have discussed in some detail in our conversation today, his legacy was broadly positive, and we Indians owe him a great deal, even if, because of the political factors I have adduced earlier, we are unwilling or unable to recognize our debt to him.
Briefly before we end, let's talk about Nehru the person. In your essay, you say, above all, he was a good man. What do you mean by that?
He was a man with humanity and compassion. You just have to listen to his speeches. If you listen to his Independence Day speeches, which were delivered, by the way, in the most beautiful Hindustani. One of the canards spread about Nehru was that he didn't speak Hindi. But you'll see that he sees nation building as a collaborative exercise. Unlike our present Prime Minister, he's not hectoring the audience, talking down to them. He's saying, "Aap aur hum saath milke ye karenge." He was, if you look at the range of his friendships, again, it's inevitable that we compare him to Modi. Does Modi have a single friend? Highly unlikely. Nehru had dozens because he was a man of great humanity. If you look at the acknowledgements to his books, if you look at the discovery of India and who all he's thanking, if you think of his friends in different countries, men as well as women, and these were women friends, with whom he was not having romantic relationships, they were just friends. It's a wonderful human gift to be able to befriend people across generations, across genders, across languages. That was the kind of man he was. I mean, he had his failings. He was occasionally prone to vanity, to thinking he's indispensable. We've discussed that. But he was a profoundly decent man. And I think that kind of decency is terribly rare in Indian politics today.
We're talking about Nehru the man. How important in his life was Edwina Mountbatten? And did she give him a certain affection that he needed at a time when perhaps he needed it most of all?
So, there were two people Nehru looked up to. Three people, really. Three people, all men, all Indian men, Nehru looked up to. One is well known, who was Mahatma Gandhi. The other two were his father, Motilal, and Rabindranath Tagore, with whom he had a particularly close and intimate relationship of veneration. Now, Motilal died in, I think, 1931. Tagore died in 1941. Gandhi died in 1948. Patel, who was his closest political colleague, died in 1950. Nehru and Edwina came in. So Edwina at a time when Nehru had lost his three anchors, Edwina stepped in to be his anchor, his confidant, his sounding board, and his friend. And it's again, I think it's quite lovely, regardless of whether they had, their relationship was beyond, the emotional. I mean, it's I think a very endearing part of the relationship. And by the way, there was no, contrary to what people say, there was no cost. That relationship exacted no cost to his statesmanship, his decision-making powers, his stewardship of the government. She was a friend. And again, I mean, friendship is what humanity is about. Again, allow me to ask this question. Does our Prime Minister have a single friend? Is there, someone he deeply loves, whether man or woman, older than him or younger than him? I mean, we are all sustained by our friendships. And in politics, it is lonely. And sometimes we, in Nehru's case, as I said, his father died, Tagore died, Gandhi died, then Patel died. And maybe he wanted someone to talk to, and Edwina was there. And I think it's utterly charming as far as I'm concerned.
Now, it's often said of Nehru that he was upper caste, upper class, and clearly English was his preferred language. Was he, and I don't mean this either comically or rudely, but was he the last Englishman to rule India?
See, he once said it, in a self-deprecatory fashion, and people thought he really meant it. Not at all. He was deeply Indian. I mean, as I've already said, you just listen to his speeches in Hindustani. He was as fluent in Hindustani as he was in English. If you read his book, Discovery of India, is suffused with knowledge and understanding of the diversity and civilizational depth of this land. He was an Indian, but he was open to the rest of the world. And this is what he learned from Tagore. I'd urge particularly the younger listeners to this conversation to read Tagore's great tract Nationalism, which is a warning against xenophobia. And that's what Nehru had embraced. So, he was willing to learn from the English, the Japanese, the Chinese, the Americans, from his friends. He was a conspicuously open-minded man. But yet, he was deeply patriotic and deeply Indian. Again, it's to think of a book like Discovery of India. I mean, it's hard to conceive of a present-day politician even writing an essay of 10 pages of that literary or historical quality. And that book clearly shows how immersed he was in the different layers that make up this country.
Finally, Ram Guha, if someone born, say, in 2000, almost 40 years after Nehru died, were to ask you, what are the three most important things about Nehru I should know, what would your answer be?
Well, I think, since we're speaking in India during a deeply contentious general election, the first thing to remember about Nehru is that he deeply cared about this country, every part of it, every small element, every segment of its population, regardless of religious, linguistic, ethnic, cultural, or gender identity. That would be the first thing. The second thing would be that he had an openness to the world, as I've already discussed. He was willing to listen to and learn from currents that flew in from anywhere. This is something he learned from Gandhi and Nehru. And he deeply cared. He saw politics as a moral commitment. There's a lovely story, by the way, of his meeting Dom Moraes in 1960. Dom Moraes, the writer, had come from Oxford and was visiting Delhi. And he meets Nehru and says, Nehru asks him, what would you like to do? And he says, I have all these books to write. I'm writing a book on travel, then I'm writing a book of poetry. And Nehru said, I could have been written more books too. He was a wonderful writer. And yet he saw politics as a public service, as a calling. And he died, serving this country.
Ram Guha, thank you very much for opening our eyes to a Prime Minister. If we have forgotten, we've forgotten at our loss. I think hundreds of thousands who will watch this program will be very grateful to you for presenting Nehru objectively, but critically, fairly with praise, but also with due criticism where it was deserved. It's that objectivity that I thank you for. Take care, stay safe.
Thank you, Karan.
Hi, I'm Karan Thapar. Over the last few years, I hope you've been watching my program, The Interview on the Wire. During that period, I've interviewed doctors, politicians, businessmen, scientists, authors, and even the occasional Nobel laureate. For me, it's been exciting. I hope it's been enjoyable for you. But these, as you know, are tough times, and if this program is going to remain bold, independent, and sometimes even defiant, then I think we need your support. At the end of the day, it's a truism, but editorial independence is best defended by the viewers. So if you would like this program to remain the way it is, forthright, outspoken, and interesting, then would you consider supporting us? All you have to do is to click on the description at the bottom. But more than anything else, I hope you will continue to watch The Interview. Your viewership means an awful lot to me.